In today's video, we're going to take a look at a tool that I've bought recently that's probably one of the most useful tools that I own at this point. And that is this cheap CCTV tester from AliExpress. But if you're not interested in CCTV, don't switch off yet, because while it sounds a bit weird, I didn't buy the CCTV tester to test CCTV. This device has a lot of really interesting features that make it great if you do things like network cable installation, building up network patch leads, or things like server administration. It's actually a really useful, versatile device. So in this video, we'll take a look at all those features. This particular model is the IPC5100. It doesn't seem to really have a brand. It's very much one of those sort of AliExpress white label products that's then rebranded under lots of different names. And this particular device here, I've seen from a lot of different places, even in the UK, where you can buy it from places like actual CCTV supply companies that either sell CCTV hardware or CCTV brands, that basically rebrand this under their own name and sell it. And when you're buying it from those places, this device sells for maybe around about £300. You can buy the generic sort of version on Amazon for maybe £220, £230, something like that. But if you buy this from AliExpress like I did, it only costs £160, which included the shipping. So that actually makes this really good value. And it definitely means if you're buying one of these and you don't need, say, the support or the warranty of a UK supplier, don't go paying the £300 that some places charge for this, just buy it from AliExpress. And there's links in the description if you're interested in buying one of these. But yeah, as I've mentioned, this is a really useful device, even if you're not testing CCTV. So in this video, we'll take a look at those features. So essentially what this device is it's a device designed for people testing CCTV. I know I keep saying testing CCTV. But what this is designed for is if you're, say, installing a camera on a building, you can set your camera up, mount it, go up a ladder with this, plug an analog camera into here, or plug an IP camera into the LAN port, and get a video feed from it. And it's really neat because it means you can view the video feed, you can angle the camera, and for things like IP cameras, it's really smart because it can provide PoE to the camera. It can then run a DHCP server to give the camera an IP address. It'll then find the camera on the network and show a video feed from it. So it's definitely really useful if you're doing that sort of work. However, what this also can do is it can test network cables, and it's much better than other network cable testers I've used, which is really useful. And while you can see here it's got an analog sort of composite video input, it's also got an HDMI input and a VGA input, which means this can be used as a really nice little portable monitor. It's also battery operated, which makes it really useful for working in, say, back to server racks, stuff like that. And what we'll take a look at later is you can even record and screenshot from the HDMI and VGA inputs, which makes it great for generating documentation. So that's the device there. Sees that enough, we'll put that aside and take a look at the accessories it comes with. It comes with the manual. It's not the worst thing I've seen. English is a bit amusing in parts, but yeah, it's pretty good. Shows all the features. And then we get the accessories. So the first accessory it comes with is stuck in the bag. And it's this remote device. This is used for if you're testing a network cable to put on the remote end. It can also test PoE, and you'll see it's a bit of a weird long shape with a thing on the end. This can also act as a cable tracer, essentially a toner. You connect this to the end of a cable, and you can then touch this to different cables, and it'll beep when you're touching the cable that this is connected to. So we'll try that out later. And this is also really useful. It's the sort of thing that you can buy several different tools to do the features of, but this can do so much just as a single unit. Other devices, you get a charger. Unfortunately, it is a 12-volt barrel jack, so you can't charge it off of micro USB or something like that. You do need to use the charger. It's just a sort of 12-volt 1-amp adapter, so I suppose you could use some sort of other 12-volt supply, but yeah, it does come with a separate power brick for it. BNC cable, which you'll be using obviously for CCTV. Comes with a bunch of different breakout leads that will make more sense once we've looked at the connections on the device. But essentially it's got this, which is RS485, to a pair of crocodile clips. This, which is a 3.5mm to a pair of crocodile clips, that's for audio coming from a camera. This DC barrel jack, which is for the 12-volt output on this to connect to cameras. You'd use this if you're, say, testing an analog camera that needs a separate DC supply. And then this here, which is just a RJ45 to BNC connector. You'd use this if you want to use a cable tracer to trace a BNC cable. So that's what that's for there. It also comes with a couple of straps. You've got this one here that goes around the back of the device and kind of fits on like that. So you could use that to, say, attach to the top of a ladder or onto say, some scaffolding or a pole, which is quite useful. Then it also comes with this sort of neck lanyard type thing that you can put around the corner there. And good to have straps. If you're up a ladder, you don't want to probably drop that from the height. But yeah, that's all the accessories it comes with. We won't really need any of them in this video because I'm not actually testing CCTV, but it does come with all of those. But now let's go in and take a look at the device itself. So here we have the device. It feels pretty well made. It's definitely quite chunky, you know, it's not exactly small at all, but it feels pretty decent. I maybe wouldn't drop it from a lot of height. You know, this plastic on the back is maybe not the most robust in the world, and the screen's probably not super well protected. But it does have these rubber corners, and they do protrude from the front, so if you did drop it face down, the screen is kept off the ground, which is good. Of course, unless there's like stones or something that would protrude, but it feels okay. And let's take a look at the features. So on the back, you can see we've got the battery compartment. This is actually quite nice. It has a removable battery. So you can pop that battery out and you can change it. Something you don't get on a lot of devices nowadays. And I have found these on AliExpress, you can buy them. If you search sort of CCTV Tester battery and then find ones that just look the same, you'll probably be able to find this. They're not the cheapest thing in the world, but you can get spare batteries, which means if the battery ever failed, you could get a new one, or you could charge a few up and then take them with you, so you could swap the battery in the field. And I've also tested, and it does work without a battery installed. You can just plug it into mains and power it off that. So that means, like, worst case, several years down the line, if the battery failed and you couldn't get a replacement, you can still run it off the mains or like an external DC supply. But yeah, we can put that back in there. So that's the battery there, which is really good. Now if we take a look at the ports. So on the bottom, we've got the DC input, that's for that charger. An RS485 output, that's a serial protocol. This is generally going to be used for pan-tilt zoom cameras. More, not necessarily IP cameras, but like analog pan-tilt zoom cameras. This is just what you'd use to like connect to the pan-tilt zoom controller essentially. Obviously it's not something I would really be using, but it does have that. It does also have some interesting software for monitoring RS485, so I don't know if that could be useful if you're doing some sort of development or playing with an RS485 device, but yeah, it's an RS485 port. 3.5mm audio input, that'll be useful if you've got a camera with a built-in microphone, you can plug it into there. UTP/SCAN, now this is the network port you would use for testing network cables. So if you're connecting a network cable into that and then want to connect it into this is the port you'd use. VGA port, that's an input, not an output, which as I mentioned earlier, you can use this as a VGA monitor, which is really nice. Then taking a look around the top, we've got more ports. We've also got the power switch. This is actually a white LED torch basically. You can use this as a light, which feels like a bit of a gimmick, but actually if you're buried in a comms cabinet trying to find something, having a torch on something that's in your hand is very useful. Saves you digging out your phone or whatever. Micro SD card slot. This doesn't come with an SD card pre-installed, but I've just put one in. You can use this to, for example, store recordings and screenshots, or PDF reports you've generated from cable testing. 12V DC output. This is something you'd use if you're testing analog cameras. A LAN port, and this is where you connect things like IP cameras. You do use it for some of the cable testing, and this can also provide PoE to a camera, so that's really good. The HDMI input I talked about, so you can use it as an HDMI monitor. And then this BNC plug here, that's used for analog cameras. So it supports a bunch of different analog camera protocols, composite, and various others that I can't quite remember off the top of my head. We'll see a list of them when we get it switched on. And there's also a slightly higher end one that's not much more expensive, I think it's about 10 or more expensive, which is the IPC5200, and that has an SDI port as well. So if you want an SDI device, you can get that one. It's also got a speaker on the back, so yeah, pretty nice. And on the front you can see you've got a 5-inch screen. This is a capacitive touchscreen, and as far as I'm aware it's 1080p. Not huge, does feel a little bit small at times, but it actually makes it a really good good sized device. There is a 7-inch version you can buy as well, but actually having bought this, I'm glad I went for the smaller one, just because even though the screen's quite small, it's quite chunky around it, so this makes it quite portable. And then you've got these capacitive buttons here you can use just to control certain features. So now let's turn it on and try it out. So now let's turn it on. To do that, there's just a button on top you can hold down, and that'll boot up. There we go, so just like that there. Start up. Takes a little minute to boot, not too bad. But this thing does underneath run Android. It's quite skinned, you don't really see that it's Android, but it is. It's actually Android 5, which is pretty old, but it's a sort of device that's fairly embedded. You know, you're not going to run different apps on this. It doesn't have an app store. You'll see the interface is very much not like Android. So it's not really a huge issue that it's very out-of-date software. But yeah, it runs Android underneath. That's it started up there. So what I'll now do is we'll go a little bit closer, take a look at the interface. Now, I won't be testing all the CCTV functionality on this because I don't actually have suitable cameras. The cameras I have are Unify, which I really like, but they're very proprietary and don't work with things like this that are like standards, that follow standards. You can't use like a Unify camera with lots of standard NVRs. So I don't actually have suitable cameras to test this with, but I'll do a quick look through the CCTV functionality, then I'll go into the stuff that I'm actually interested in, which is things like the network cable testing and then the video inputs. Cool, so I've come in a bit closer, and I've turned the brightness on the screen up, and it actually goes quite bright, which is good. That's really useful if you're out in like a bright sunlight environment. You want to be able to have quite a bright screen. And it seems pretty good, it's got decent viewing angles and everything. So now if we quickly go through the apps it's got in terms of CCTV cameras, just to get that out of the way, you can see we've got this IPC Test Pro application, and this is probably what you use most of the time if you've got a suitable camera. If we turn it on here, it'll output PoE, and it'll run a DHCP server. That then means I can just plug any camera into this, that's compatible anyway, it'll power the camera, it'll give it an IP address, it'll then scan the network for that IP address, and then it'll connect to the camera. So that's really useful. This means that you can essentially use this as a monitor for IP cameras without having to configure them. You don't want to be balancing up a ladder with a laptop trying to connect in and then a PoE switch or a PoE injector to try and power a camera. So having this is really good because it means you can sit next to the camera and adjust it while looking at this monitor. Whereas when I've tried to do CCTV before, you end up sort of standing outside with a monitor on the ground trying to see it, or you've got someone inside shouting directions from the video feed that they're seeing. So being able to use this is really good. Now, as I mentioned, this has got PoE output. It's a little bit quirky because it's got this little toggle switch next to PoE there, but irrespective of whether I toggle that on or off, it will always be outputting PoE when this app's open. When the app's closed, it doesn't, but yeah, when you open this application, it outputs PoE. So a little bit quirky that toggle switch there doesn't work, but it's fine. The other thing to bear in mind though with this is it does run a DHCP server when you open this application. And there's a couple of other places in it you can enable the DHCP server. So you probably want to be quite careful plugging this into certain networks. Now, if you're installing something in, say, a business environment, I probably wouldn't recommend plugging a cheap device from AliExpress into their corporate network. But you definitely want to be very careful with that if you were, because if you did it, it would probably be fine most of the time. But then if you accidentally open the wrong application and it starts a DHCP server that sits on their network and starts giving out the wrong IPs to a bunch of devices, you might not be very popular. So yeah, you just want to be a bit careful that if you're opening certain applications and you do have it plugged into a network, make sure you don't run a DHCP server if you don't actually intend to run it. But yeah, this is a very useful application and I wish I had a camera I could test it with. In the future, if I do get a suitable camera, I might do a follow-up video looking at the CCTV testing features of this because this actually seems like something that would be really useful. Now if we come out of IPC Test Pro, we've got this option here that's just IP Camera Test, and this just has a bunch of other applications. So it's got things like IPC Test Pro, a button to toggle the power output for PoE and the 12-volt output on the top, devices for things for scanning for IPs on the network, viewing things from OnViv compliant cameras. It's got separate apps for Hikvision cameras, Dahuya, I think you pronounce them, cameras, and Huawei cameras. These apps are all very similar, they're just tailored for different cameras. So you can, if you've got certain cameras, you can use these apps. Obviously I don't have that, but if I do get a future camera, I'd be interested in trying it out. You've also got things like the QQ browser and Chrome, so it's got a little web browser on it. That can be quite useful because if you're, say, wanting to just access the web management interface on a camera to set an IP address and you've not got a laptop handy, this could be good for that. And this is how I found it runs Android 5, because if you go into settings, that must be settings, you go into settings here, and then about Chrome, you can see there it's Android 5.1.1. So that's how I found that out. But yeah, it runs Chrome. It's not super fast, you probably wouldn't want to use it a lot, but it actually is usable. So if you need to access, say, a management interface on the camera, you could actually do that. Other things here, it's got one for previewing multiple cameras at the same time, stuff like that. And then one that is actually quite useful, which is virtual IPC, which means this can act as a virtual camera. So now to test out virtual IPC, I've plugged it into the network, and then gone into the settings, and gone to IP settings, and made sure it's set to use DHCP to get an IP, because sometimes it's set to a static IP address. And this is also where you need to be careful, because there's another option to turn the DHCP server on there. And I have found sometimes it'll turn on, and like one of the applications will turn it on and not turn it off properly. So yeah, you need to be very careful, but it's on the network and it's got an IP over DHCP. Now, if I go back into here and open up that virtual IPC app, it'll come up, it'll show this screen and give an RTSP address. And if I type that into laptop here, like that, I've just taken that URL there and just typed into VLC on this laptop, just as a sort of test application to show it. And if I run that, there you go. It shows what seems to just be a random video that someone's taken at their desk in an office. So it's clearly just someone working for the manufacturer or developing the firmware who's just grabbed their phone and filmed some plants to get a bit of test footage. But that video is actually streaming from this device. So if I were to unplug this, for example, that video stops because it's actually coming from this. So this could actually be really useful. You know, if you need to test a device, say a DVR or something, and you're not sure if it's the problems with the camera or if it's with the DVR itself, you could actually use this to essentially pretend to be a camera. So that's actually a really useful little feature. Something dead simple, you know, you could make a laptop do this exact same thing, but just having it all built into a single box actually is really nice. So that was a quick run through of all the IP camera testing stuff, which I don't really have a huge use for. So let's take a look at the features I will be using. And we'll start off with the video inputs. So if we go into here, it shows all the different video inputs it can support from all different types of cameras. You've got Auto HD, which is designed for the analog input here, for all different types of HD analog cameras. I don't necessarily know all of these off the top of my head, I don't really know what they all are, but you've got HD CVBS, CVI, AHD, and TVI. And that's all different protocols you can use to connect into here, which is how you connect in analog IP cameras. I'm pretty sure is it CVI, one of these can just essentially be composite video, which I haven't really tried, but yeah, if you've got analog cameras, you can plug them in there and use these apps to view them. And then Auto HD just seems to pick whichever one, it just seems to, you know, automatically pick which type you've got connected. But we won't really be using those, but what we will be using is the HDMI and VGA inputs. So let's try these out. So first we'll try VGA, and this is the thing I found the most useful with this. Because quite often I have to set up things like servers. So if you've watched my videos for a very long time, you might remember this old machine. This is that AliExpress router. Quite fitting actually using another AliExpress product with this. It's been a great little thing, but I don't really use it much now. But yeah, quite often I find myself having to set up a server. Whether that's going into one that's not lost network connection and plug a keyboard, mouse and monitor in and try and work out what's going on, or whether it's something like this that I need to, say, reinstall an operating system on, or I just need to go into the BIOS to configure something. A lot of the time you need a monitor. Now sometimes that's fine, you know, you're in a data centre, there's probably a crash cart you can grab, but someone might be using it. Or you might be in, say, a comms room that doesn't have any sort of monitors, or you're in an office with a wall-mounted comms cabinet, and you end up having to steal a monitor off someone's desk and precariously balance it on a bit of furniture to try and get it in because you've not got a long VGA cable, and it's a bit of a nightmare. And you don't really need a big 20-odd inch monitor just to access a BIOS, so this device is perfect for that. It's also battery operated, so you don't need to find a plug. So here we've got this, so we've got a little VGA cable here we can test it out with, so we plug that in there, turn it around, stick the VGA cable into the bottom, and now if we turn the server on, we'll see that it'll boot up on the screen. Flick that switch there. That'll boot up, in a second we'll get a video output. There we go, we can see it booting. And that's what makes this just so useful. It'll automatically switch between all different resolutions. It occasionally loses video as it's booting up, changing resolutions and stuff, but you can see that's it going through there, and that's it booting up into OpenWRT. So yeah, this actually works really well as a very tiny little VGA monitor. And because the screen's 1080p, it's pretty sharp. So this is currently showing a 1024 by 768 feed. And even though the text is absolutely tiny, if you move your face close enough to it, you can read it perfectly fine. So it's not like it's, you know, really compressing it down to a small, low resolution screen. You know, I can read all that text. And if you need to, you can press that button there and zoom in on it. So yeah, it's actually really, really useful. Zoom out again there. And we can go back out. Cool, so now I've rebooted it and come back into the BIOS just so we can take a look at it more. And as you can see, we can now flick through here and totally control this using this tiny little monitor. And this is the other feature that makes this extremely useful. There's a snapshot button and a record button. This means that I can take screenshots and video recordings of the VGA input, which can be really useful for things like documentation. If you're writing, say, instructions on how to configure a BIOS on a machine, you don't need to now take photos of the screen on a camera and then try and edit them to look decent, or try and get expensive video capture hardware. You know, I can be in the BIOS here, and I can just press the snapshot button. It makes a very sort of cheesy camera sound, and that's now taking that image. And because I've got the micro SD card in, it'll store it on the micro SD card. Otherwise, it'll store it on its like internal storage, and you can get it off, but you need to like enable an FTP server that runs on this. It's a bit fiddly, so I'd just stick a micro SD card in. But yeah, that image is now stored on that micro SD card. It can also record video from the VGA input, which is also extremely useful. So if you're recording a tutorial, you can now do that. Hit record, it's now recording. And now if I were to flick through the BIOS, you can now see the recording and see it's actually recorded it all. Now, the video quality isn't amazing. It's, you know, it's a little bit compressed and a little bit, you know, it's not super sharp as analog input as well, but it does work. So you maybe wouldn't want to use this to say record, I don't know, gameplay footage to edit into your videos, but if you're just trying to do something like this, it's really quite neat. And I'm thinking back to when I used to do a lot more videos of like retro computers. This would have actually been so useful to record that VGA input rather than having to like just film screens like I used to do. Because even though it's not amazing quality, it's definitely better than trying to film a screen. So we stop recording there, and yeah, it works really well. The one thing I have found that's a bit weird is it records the audio from a built-in microphone. Now that makes sense for VGA because it doesn't have any sort of audio input. But yeah, the audio comes from the microphone, which is a bit strange. I suppose that could be good though if you're recording documentation. Even if you're just wanting to like narrate over something for your future reference, you could do that. But yeah, it records audio from the built-in microphone when you're recording the analog input, which is a bit weird. The only sort of issue I've found that isn't really, it's a very understandable issue, is that if you're recording and the screen resolution changes, it'll stop recording. Now that's only really an issue if you're say wanting to record a boot sequence of a machine, because like with this machine in particular, as it's booting up, the screen resolution changes around. You know, it starts off really low and then the bootloader comes in and then that's a different resolution, and the OS boots and then changes resolution halfway through the boot process. And if it's doing that, it will periodically stop the recording. But yeah, that's the only quirk I found. And yes, those are now recorded and you can play them back on the device, or you can get the files off of it. And yeah, this feature is probably one of the ones I found the most useful. Because even the other day I was having to configure, essentially, it was a server, but it was running as a router. But because it was running as a router, it was just installed in a wall-mounted comms cabinet. And this is quite high off the ground, probably about 5 feet off the ground. And I needed to just plug a monitor into it just to quickly reinstall the operating system. You know, get it to a state where I can access it over the network, and then I could go away and sit at a desk. Without this, I'd be balancing a monitor precariously on top of the filing cabinet to try and use it. But with this, I could simply just stick it in the rack in front of the router, plug it into the short VGA cable, and use it. You can also go into settings and then go on to screen rotation and press that to rotate the screen upside down. And that means you could basically have it the other way up. So it meant when I had it in the cabinet, I could stand it on its bottom face like that with the VGA cable sticking out the top. So that was pretty useful. So yeah, that is the VGA input. So that's probably one that I'll be using the most, just because the number of times I need to set up something that's got a VGA output and I don't have a monitor to hand, this is very handy. But it also supports HDMI. So to test that out, we'll open the HDMI in app, which is just the same thing. And we'll just test it with this Amazon Fire Stick, just because it's the small HDMI device I have to hand. Plug that in there, and I'll just plug it into the server to power it. Hopefully that has enough output power on USB. Stick that in there. And then hopefully we should be able to see that Fire Stick boot up on this device. There we go, so you see it's booting. And that is, yeah, HDMI. So I'll just let this boot and come back, because this is a very old Fire Stick, so it takes an age to boot up. But yeah, we'll just let this boot up and I'll come back and show it. Okay, so that's now booted up. These old Fire Sticks are super slow. But yeah, that's it running. And as before, you can see the video. And this will actually play sound from HDMI. I won't be able to, just because obviously copyrighted stuff playing from this, but sound from the HDMI will come out the built-in speaker, which is useful. Although weirdly, when you record, it still doesn't record the sound from the HDMI directly. It still just records the built-in microphone, which obviously picks up the sound from the speaker, so that's not ideal. But yeah, that's it showing the HDMI video there. And yeah, it works really well. And like before, I can go into here, I can take a snapshot, and that'll take a snapshot image. I can also hit record, and then I can, you know, record that and you'll get a live video feed from it. Now, if you notice the recording being a bit choppy, that's because this Fire Stick is just super slow. So it can barely run its own interface smoothly. But yeah, the HDMI snapshot or video quality isn't as good as obviously a dedicated HDMI capture device, which would be properly sharp. This one's maybe a little bit compressed looking. But having such a cheap device that can just record HDMI, just for the off chance you might need to do it, it's really good. Currently, you can see this is going at 1080p 60 frames a second, but as far as the manual says, it can do 4K up to 4K 30, which is really good. I've not tried it with 4K 30, but apparently it can do it. So yeah. This can act as both an HDMI and VGA monitor, and can also record and take screenshots from them. And that, in such a small portable battery operated device, is extremely useful. Now let's take a look at the reason I initially bought this, which is the network cable testing features. If you're installing huge networks in businesses, or you may be doing like data center installations or something like that, you'll have a proper fluke tester, so you can actually certify all the cables. However, if you're just doing stuff yourself in your house, or you're maybe an electrician just doing small scale data projects, buying a fluke tester is a bit over the top. I mean, they cost thousands. So a lot of the time you're going to buy something like this, which is just a cheap cable continuity tester, and they cost around £5. They're basically nothing, cost absolutely nothing, and they're useful little tools. All they really do is just test the continuity of all the wires. So we take a cable, plug it into there, plug the other end into there. You can of course separate these, so you could have these in separate rooms if you're testing structured cabling. And then you turn it on, and all it does is just count down each wire. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and it just flashes down all the wires in sequence. And if all the lights light up, it shows all the wires are connected correctly. The G doesn't light up on this just because it's not a shielded cable, so the ground doesn't light up, but that's fine. Then we've got the sort of the slower mode as well. It counts down the slower. It's basically the same thing, and yeah, it works absolutely fine. But now let's take a look at this other device and see what it does. So it works in a very similar way. You take the remote end, plug one end of the cable into that. On this one you need to turn the remote end on, and then stick the other end into the UTP scan port. So there's a separate port on the bottom for the cable tester, not the LAN port on the top. You use the UTP scan port on the bottom. Plug that in there. Then if you open up the cable tester app, which is that one there, it'll open up and it'll show all the wires are connected. And then the remote end will beep, which could be useful, but there's a mute button as well. I mean, that could be useful if you need to listen from a distance, but yeah, you can mute that as well. And like the other one, it'll show on there in sequence the lights showing what's connected. So if you were to make it beep as well, it'll count down the numbers in sequence, but it's not showing up very well on camera just because it's an LED against a white background. But yeah, works in the same way and shows it here. Now instantly this already has one better feature, and it's how quick it gives the result. Because with this one you have to wait for it to count down all the individual LEDs, which can take quite a while. With this one, obviously if I unplug it there, it'll detect it's all disconnected. But if I plug that in there, it literally takes a second or so for it to test the cable out. So it's much quicker. And then as you can see up here, it also says it's the cable type is 100M through, 1000M through, so it shows the gigabit cable. I don't think that this is actually like testing the connection or certifying it or anything. I think it's just more from a wiring perspective that it's wired for gigabit, for gigabit communication basically. It also says remote kit number 255, and that matches the number on the back here. So I suspect that's designed that you could potentially have multiple of these with different ID numbers and then identify them from the remote end. However, I looked online and you can buy these separately, but I couldn't find any listings that specify that you could buy them with different numbers. And I've popped this open and there isn't any sort of dip switches you could set, so I don't know how you get different remote numbers, but I think that's what that basically means. It's just that 255 means, well, the 255 on the back of that. But yeah, it shows all the continuity. But on its own, you're probably thinking, well, that's nice, but that's probably not worth significantly more money just because it gives a result quicker. But where this device really shines is if there's a problem. So to test that, I've made up this cable here, which is deliberately faulty. I've just cut one of the wires off from one of the ends. And if we plug that into the basic tester, we'll see that it's faulty. So we plug that end in there, that end in there. And if we turn the tester on, you'll see it'll flash the all numbers in sequence, but you'll see it'll miss out number 3. So you can see that number 3 is faulty. And that's great. However, this is then where one of these testers becomes really annoying, because it tells you that the number 3 is not connected, but it doesn't tell you where that break is. So you don't know whether it's an issue at one of the ends, or if it's like the cable snapped internally. And the number of times I've used this tester and just had something that's not terminated correctly, and I've ended up having to like re-terminate multiple things to get it right. I had it before when I was doing the previous network install actually, that I did a video on. One of the network ports had one of the wires disconnected. So I remember I went up the attic, looked at that end, it looked fine, looked at the jack in the room, it looked fine. So we couldn't really tell which end the fault was at, so I just had to guess and re-terminate one of them. And of course, it was the other end that had the problem, so I ended up having to re-terminate both ends just to eliminate the problem, because this wouldn't tell me where the problem was. Additionally, if you've got, say, a patch lead like this and you don't know which end it is, you end up having to cut an end off and then still isn't there, so you're wasting connectors and losing cable length every time you do that. So it's really annoying because this just doesn't tell you where the problem is. And that's where this device really comes into its own. Because if I take this cable out here, like that, and plug the faulty cable in, this will actually tell us which end the problem's at. So plug that in there, and you can see straight away it says that all the wires are connected at the meter end, but they're not connected at the remote end because, well, they're not connected. But if I plug this into the remote end here, like that, you can see it now lights up and it shows that all the wires are connected straight through, apart from number 3, which is not connected at the remote end. And we can verify that if we pull that out there and check the remote end. You probably won't come out on camera, but you can maybe see there that you've got white, orange, orange, and then a missing wire. Basically the white, green I've deliberately cut out. So you can correctly see that that is the end that's got the problem. And just for completeness, if we swap them round, plug the faulty end into the tester, straight away it identifies that the number 3 isn't connected at the tester end, and if we plug the other end in there, that'll just verify that the other end is all connected apart from wire 3. So that correctly identifies at which end the break is. So if I wanted to fix this cable, I know that I need to fix this end, I need to re-terminate this jack, and there's nothing wrong with that one. So that's really useful, and that makes this device really come into its own. Just this feature alone, it's super useful. This device can also correctly identify if the break is in the middle of the cable. So what we'll do for that, just to test it, is we've got this cable here, which we've established is fine at this end, and it's broken at this connector here. So we're going to use this like splitter here. This is actually for an RS45 interlink on some Eaton PDUs, but it works for just coupling a couple of cables together. So we put that in there, and what essentially we've got here is we've got a long cable, and the break is at this point here, so it's broken in the middle. So now if we plug that into here, like that, we'll see it's now correctly figured out that the break is actually in the middle of the cable. You can see there it shows number 3, it's connected at this end, connected at the remote end, but it's broken in the middle. So that's also really useful. You can tell if the cable is broken somewhere down the line, so you're not going to sit for ages re-terminating both ends of a cable, only to find the cable's damaged in the middle. Additionally, as a quick test, I also wanted to see what would happen if you're essentially testing, say, a wall jack, which obviously means you would have to have a small length of cable from the wall jack to the tester. But it does seem okay for that. So if we imagine that this is essentially a network port in the wall, you know, it's got a cable terminated into the back, which is basically simulated by this here, and one of the wires isn't connected correctly, and we want to test that. Now, obviously, if we used a long patch lead like this, it would detect, like we saw here, where it detects the fault being in the middle of the cable. But it does seem to have some sort of threshold in it. So if I use a much shorter patch lead like this, from our simulated wall port into the bottom of the tester, this time, it correctly detects that the fault is at this end of the cable. So it's not treating it, because this cable is obviously a lot shorter, it's not treating the fault as being in the middle of the cable, it's treating it being at this end. So it means if you had, say, a wall jack, you know, Keystone modules or Euro modules, you could actually test those. And that would demonstrate that the fault is at the jack that I'm testing. So this would have absolutely saved me probably about 15 minutes of time at the previous install, just by not having to re-terminate the wrong jack while standing in an attic. So yeah, it will also work detecting the end of a cable as long as you, from a wall plate, if you're using a small enough patch lead. So yeah, it actually seems pretty good. And of course it also detects things like crossover cables. So if I grab a crossover cable here, not that you'd really ever use a crossover cable nowadays, but plug the crossover cable into there, plug the crossover cable into the tester there, and there you go, it detects it being a crossover cable, which isn't something really you're going to deal with nowadays. You know, most switches nowadays will just auto detect cables and work correctly. But there have been times where I've been in places with older switching where someone's left a crossover cable lying around and you're plugging this cable into a switch and it just doesn't work and you can't work out why. This would at least tell you it's a crossover cable. So yeah, it shows it's a crossover cable there. And on this end it also shows whether it's a direct cable or a crossover. So yeah, that works quite well too. So yeah, that's it tested there. And obviously if it was a shielded cable, the ground would also light up as well. So yeah, that works really, really well. And the fact that this can tell you the end of the cable that the fault is at can save so much time. And if you're doing this enough, this device could almost pay for itself after you've had a few dodgy terminations, just in your time for not having to go and re-terminate both ends of a cable hoping you find the right one. Also, another very quick observation I just made, literally after I finished filming everything else, I was just going to like fix this cable that I deliberately put the fault in, and discovered that you can actually test individual ends of the cable with this alone. I don't know how supported it is. I don't know if it's meant to do that or it's maybe less accurate if you've not got the other end on it. But if you turn it on there and then plug one of the ends in, like that, none of the LEDs come on. But if you press this RJ45 status / mute button, you can press that, and you see there, maybe on camera, I'll turn the lights down because it's a little bit too bright. There you go. You can see there that it shows connection 3 on this end isn't connected. And if I swap it for the other end, like that there, it lights them all up. So yeah, it seems as though this end on its own can actually test individual ends of a cable. Now, again, I don't know how supported that is. It might be, because it does say RJ45 status on there. So you need to turn it on, press that RJ45 status / mute button, and you can plug it in. But it does seem to just test the individual ends. Now, this could be quite nice. I'm just thinking, say you're going around a building, and you're just terminating a bunch of RJ45 jacks on the wall, or say a patch panel. This could be good as just a first port of call, just to check your termination's correct by quickly plugging this in, checking it, and not having to run off the remote end and constantly plug the remote device in. So, yeah, very random observation. It's a bit undocumented, but yeah, press that button, and it'll just tell you the continuity of a single end that you've connected to it. Yeah, there you go, it took a little while. There you go. So yeah, bit of a random observation, but yeah, it can do that too. The other thing that this can do is act as a cable tracer. Of course, this is the sort of thing you can buy as a separate device, but just having it all integrated into the one product is really good. Now for that, you do need to buy the one that comes with this remote end. This is also available with much smaller remote ends, similar to like this one here, that doesn't have the built-in tracer functionality, so you need to buy the one with this larger remote end. But what this means is you can you can connect it to a cable, and then like sort of remotely detect that tone on the cable to identify cables. So I plugged one cable in here. If you open up the app here, cable tracer, and that'll also start sending that signal down the wire. So turn this on here. This knob almost adjusts sensitivity. So you see that's currently there. And if I bring it closer to the wire, it's plugged into the tester, it beeps indicating signal strength. And as I bring it closer, it gets louder. And if I bring it away, the signal gets weaker. Bring it closer to the, say, green wire, it's not the same one. No real response. Bring it closer to that one, again, no real response. Bring it closer to this one. So this makes it extremely useful. Now, obviously in this situation here, if you can't tell these wires apart, you're probably unable to see any sort of colour at all. But this is really useful if you've, say, got structured cabling in a building and it's unlabelled. I'm thinking back to previously when I had a fun situation when I ran some structured cabling in a house, and we did it as like a first fix. So we installed it when the house was being built, and then we told the instructions to the builder was leave them, hanging out the walls, we'll come back and terminate them into jacks. But we came back to the house and found that they'd helpfully terminated all our Cat 6 into phone jacks. They'd literally put 6 phone jacks in the living room. That's a whole other story. Now that was easy enough to fix. We just had to take all the phone jacks off and put network jacks on. But in the process of re-terminating them all, they cut the cables shorter and cut off all the numbers we'd left on them. So that meant I ended up had an absolute nightmare shorting out one end of each cable, then going into the other end and testing with a multimeter to try and find the one that had the problem. So having one of these would have been so useful. All I would need to do is terminate all the jacks, plug this into one end, go down to the cupboard we're putting the patch panel in, test each cable with this toner until I find the one that beeps. And that would have saved so much time. So yeah, this cable toner is also extremely useful. It also has a built-in cable tester, so if you were to, say, plug a cable in like that, you can then obviously tone it out, like that there. And then once you've identified it, you can then plug the remote end in, and it will then test it for you and give you the result. So that's really useful. You can kind of have both functions at the same time. You can tone out the cables, and then you can test them. So that's really neat. And yeah, this could save so much time. It's got a few different options down here. So this is for unshielded twisted pair. It's also got an option for shielded twisted pair, which you do seem to really need. I used a shielded cable before and it didn't really work until I switched on to that. So I think that maybe makes the power higher or something. And there's a separate option here for you for testing a BNC cable, because you could actually use this to trace coax as well. You would just use this little adapter it comes with that goes into the RJ45 port on the bottom and then gives you a BNC connector to connect your BNC cable onto. So yeah, the cable tracer is also extremely useful. The final test this has is a TDR test. Now, TDR stands for Time Domain Reflectometer, and I'm not a physicist or electronics engineer, so I don't quite understand fully what all that means. But essentially what it means is it can test things like the length of a cable, where you're just from only one end being connected using like reflections of signals inside the cable or something like that. And that's what we've got here. So if we take a cable, we can try and plug it in. This generally works better with longer cables, so you probably wouldn't want to use this or bother using this with like a, tiny little patch lead. But this is great if you're testing structured cabling within a building. So we take a slightly longer patch lead here. Now for this test, you need to plug into the LAN port on the top. I suspect it's just got different chipsets. I might do a future teardown of this just to see how that works. There's also a different chipset needed for this that runs off the other port, but that goes into the top there. And if you press test once, that'll run a test, and it'll say that it's open because the other end isn't connected to anything, and it'll say that this is a 4.8 meter cable. So that correctly has tested the length of the cable. I've not tested this exact cable, but I think it's about 4.8 meters, it looks it. So yeah, that can get the length of the cable. It can also measure the attenuation, but only over longer distances. So because this cable is under 10 meters, it won't give you the attenuation. But we can also test the longer cable. So what I've got for that is, if you come over here, I've got another cable here. And essentially what this is a cable that goes into one of my wall faceplates in my room. That then goes back to the patch panel. In the patch panel, I then patch that port directly into a different port and then run it back. So essentially I've got these two cables here that go into two different wall ports, but they're essentially connected together as though it's one really long cable. So if we plug that into there and run the test again, we'll see that it's much longer. So it's saying 18.5 meters, 18.5, that's a bit shorter, but I think it's just obviously a slight margin of error. But yeah, it's testing this out to be about an 18 meter run, which is, seems about right looking at it. And it measures the attenuation. And that's really useful. It's not maybe super scientific, I don't know how calibrated this is, but especially just being able to measure the length of a cable, it's really quite handy. Because if you've got quite a long run and you're like, oh, is this going to be okay? Is this getting close to 100 meters? This will give you at least a rough idea. It also has this advanced test that basically does the same thing. It'll check the status, the length, and the attenuation. But what it also supports is reflectivity, impedance, and skew. Now, interestingly, for the first three, you need to have the other end not connected to anything. But to test the reflectivity, impedance, and skew, you need to connect it to something and get a network link. So we're going to take this cable here and plug it into a switch. Cool, so we're going to take this then, stick it over into the network switch, and then we'll do the other test. So that's plugged in there, and it's got a link. This does have a gigabit Ethernet port on it. So that's linked there. And now if we do the advanced test again, this time it won't test the status or length, but it'll test the skew, impedance, and reflectivity. The skew essentially means it's the difference in nanoseconds between the signals arriving on each of the pairs. And I think as far as I'm aware, you're meant to keep that less than 50 nanoseconds or it can start causing issues. Impedance is 100 and then reflectivity is 0. So it's not really exciting because this is obviously a good cable and it's a relatively short run. But yeah, this can also bring up other results. Now, it's not probably fully certifying it, it's not a calibrated tester, this obviously is not remotely comparable to say a fluke tester, but it can give a good idea. This can just give you a bit more information about a cable, check the length of it, check the attenuation looks okay, and then just check for any obvious issues with these figures here. So it is quite nice. What it can also do is it can create a report. It can do this for both the TDR test and the regular continuity test. You can press create report, it then lets you create report. You can put a bunch of information like project name, client name, address, in here you can just type it all in, and then you can hit save. And that does work, it then gives you a PDF, but it's not super useful, because if you view one of those PDFs, you can see it does work, it pulls it up, preview, and then loads up that PDF, and you can see all the remarks you put in at the top, as well as essentially a static image of the test results, which is quite good. However, the only annoying thing is that you can't do multiple tests and put them into a single PDF, because that would actually make this quite useful. You could go around a building, test all the ports, take all the test continuity results and put them into a single PDF, transfer it to a PC, print it out, do whatever, send it to the customer and say, here you go, here's all the continuity tests of all the network ports. But unfortunately, you can't really do that because it just produces one of these PDFs for every single test you run. So you end up with just a million PDFs. Now, I suppose you could potentially, in, say, the remarks section, put a port number generate a PDF for each port, and then separately on a computer go in and concatenate them into one big PDF. But yeah, it would be quite nice if you could say generate a report for a job and concatenate all these together. So it does let you output a report, but it's maybe not super useful. But yeah, that's TDR test. And it is just nice, especially being able to measure the length of the cable, very useful. And then also just test things like reflectivity, impedance, skew, attenuation, just all that sort of stuff, just to get a rough idea of if everything looks okay beyond just testing the basic continuity of a cable. So yeah, definitely a really nice test to have. So that was the TDR test, and that was basically all the network cable testing functionality. So that's two features I really bought this for, the network cable testing and the HDMI and VGA monitor features. However, it does have more than that. So we go into My Apps, there's a bunch of apps you can install. There's a bit you can update it and install more apps. It's not a proper app store, but there's a few like apps that are available to install that aren't installed by default. And you can install Android APKs on that, so I have been able to do that by going into Chrome, downloading an APK and installing it. So as long as it's compatible with Android 5, and I imagine it would only work if it doesn't require Google Play services, because I presume this won't have that, you can then install other Android apps as well. So it's got a few, flashlight, calculator, you can also access the flashlight just from this button here. And it is really bright, which is good. Likewise, this also has a button to turn the LED on to act as a flashlight, which is pretty handy. It's got a few different things just really to view other cameras. There's VLC on there, you can potentially view network streams with, audio recorder. The data monitor, that's for RS485. I've not tried it out, but it does seem quite good. You can potentially connect RS485 into this and send and receive different binary data, which is quite cool. And really just a bunch of other things. I've installed a bunch of other apps that are available, so there's things like for Access, TP-Link cameras, Top-C, XMI, EasyView, just a bunch of different apps for different cameras really. And yeah, you can install other Android APKs there as well. There's also a File Explorer, this lets you go through, you can go into here, you can view data on the SD card, data on the internal storage. It also has a built-in FTP server you can run, so that's good to get data off this. If you don't have if you're recording to the internal storage or you don't have a card reader, you can run an FTP server on this, connect it over FTP and pull the data off. However, the only quirk I found is that the FTP server only works over a wired Ethernet connection. This does have built-in Wi-Fi and you can connect it to a Wi-Fi network, but I was unable to get the FTP server to work over Wi-Fi. I don't know if I was just doing something wrong or it was maybe just an issue with my particular unit, but that would have been nice because it would mean, say you're out in the field and you've got a phone, you could potentially connect this to your phone's hotspot and FTP the data off, but you do need an Ethernet cable, unfortunately. But yeah, it does have the FTP server you can use to transfer data off. And if you go into here, you can go into like test records, report, TW, and you can start pulling up those tests we've done before. This also lets you access things like the screenshots and video recordings from the video inputs. Additionally, we've got the settings page. We won't go through it too much, but it's got a fair bit. It's not standard Android settings, it is like its own settings area, so you can go into there, date, time, IP settings for the local network, Wi-Fi you can set up. It can also act as a Wi-Fi hotspot, so you can connect to it, but again, I still couldn't get the FTP server to work, unfortunately, but you can use it as a Wi-Fi hotspot. Brightness settings, volume settings, SD card stuff, just very basic stuff. Another place you can start the FTP server from. Screen rotation, we've shown that before. There is also user management and lock screen stuff, so you can actually set up some sort of online registration. That's a bit dubious, I've not tried that yet. But you can set up a lock screen just to provide some sort of security lock. I've also not bothered with that. You've then got this option in here called shortcut menu. This lets you change what appears in a shortcut menu. So if you're out at the main screen and you press the home button, it gives you this like shortcut menu up here. So that lets you just specify what's in there. Other stuff in there, bit to power it off, although you can just hold that button down. Button mode selection, which is just how these buttons at the side work, whether it's single click, double click, or whether they're disabled. And then just a bunch of open source licenses, factory reset, all that sort of stuff. The settings menu also has this option for tester play, which I had no idea what it did, it was very confusing. It's just got a big start button, 1080p, 720p, 480p. Can you control, can it be displayed, and can it be intercom? And then a thing to turn on voice intercom, and I was, what's this? But if you press start, it gives you another RTSP URL. And if you go over to the laptop and connect to that, again just from VLC, that will pull up a stream showing the live video feed of the screen on this. Now it's a bit glitchy, like you go back, it's got quite a big delay on it, and it does occasionally break up a bit like this. It's a little bit weird. So it's very, very, very quirky. There's definitely some sort of underpowered CPU situation going on trying to compress the video or something. But yeah, it seems that that feature is basically designed to like share the screen with the tester as an RTSP stream. It's a bit weird. It doesn't work that well, definitely, but it's just quirky. Because even it has like this turn on voice intercom that is enabled, but it doesn't seem to do anything, whether that's enabled or disabled. You don't hear any sound. It's not like the microphone on this is coming out the laptop, so I don't know, it's maybe just VLC can't do it or something, but yeah, it's an interesting quirk that, yeah, you can sort of use this to like share the screen of the tester over the network. It's just maybe a little bit glitchy, but yeah, it's another feature it happens to have that doesn't seem to serve any purpose really, but it's got it. They've definitely crammed a lot of features into this just because they could, it seems like. So that was a run through of all the settings. The final section we'll take a look at is this network tool. And this is kind of neat, although not super useful. It's just basic sort of network testing functionality. So for example, you can do a ping test here, put a remote IP address, which it does save from the previous test, it's good, hit that, and it'll ping a remote IP. Like, it's really not that exciting, you can press stop again. You can ping things from it. Not super useful, you know, this is the sort of thing I would just use a laptop for, but maybe if you're crammed in a cupboard somewhere up a ladder trying to test an IP camera port that's not quite working, you can maybe use this rather than balancing a laptop on a ladder. So you do have that. There's also an IP scan that's kind of good. It'll just scan a subnet for devices, hit that, that'll scan a device and pull up a bunch of devices it finds. Now network test, this is essentially iPerf. Start a server, it runs a server, and it validates that this is iPerf, and then you can run iPerf on another device and run iPerf between them. So you can either run the server or the client, depending on which side you connect into. You can put the IP of your server in there, and yeah, you can run iPerf. But unfortunately, this can't do gigabit. It's got a gigabit port, but the CPU on this can only get about 400 megabit in iPerf. So, you know, not super useful. You're not going to use this as like a benchmarking device. But, you know, if you wanted to test something below, say, a few hundred megabit, or you just want a way to generate a lot of traffic over a link to maybe test for errors, it does have it, but yeah, probably wouldn't be using iPerf on this really, but it's got built-in iPerf because why not just shove random features in because you can. Now the next test here is labelled port flashing, and this is a bit of an interesting quirky test that's a little bit broken in some ways but sometimes works. Essentially all it does is you give it a network link, and then when you start this test it just brings the network link down and then brings it up again every few seconds. And I think the idea is just so that if you say got a switch somewhere connected to structured cabling and you want to be able to like tone out a cable, you need to identify where the remote end of a cable is, you can like, you know, plug this into one end like a network port in a room, go through to the switches and try and find which port's got a link coming up and down. I'm struggling to think of when you would really use it unless, you know, you've got a place that's totally unlabeled and yeah, you have to. It's the sort of thing that you probably can't really think of a use for it until you're stuck in the field needing it and go, actually that would be a useful feature. And it does work, but it's a little bit quirky. So I've got it connected into this router here. You can see it's got a link. On this device here, the left orange LED indicates activity and the one on the right indicates a link. And if we start this test here, it'll say that the LED will be on here and the link will be up. And then when the LED goes out on the screen, you see the link goes down on the router. And just every few seconds, it'll show on there, link comes up, and you see that link will just come up and down every few seconds. And it does work. One thing I did find that was a bit weird is that I had this set to use DHCP to get an IP address. And when it was set to use DHCP, this router isn't giving out IP addresses currently, it's not got DHCP set up. So I had to go into this and tell it to use a static IP address, and then it worked. When it was set to DHCP, even though this shouldn't need an IP address, it was just kept saying, please insert a cable. So I had to go and tell us to use a static IP address, which was a bit weird. But it does seem to work now. The only other quirk I found with this though is sometimes the test doesn't stop. Yeah, like that there. Oh no, that works, that did stop. I've had it before where the test doesn't stop, so it just keeps blinking the LED on and off again and then won't stop from here. And then when you quit the app, the network port just gets stuck in the state it was last in, which could be that it was down. And the only way to fix that is to restart the device. So yeah, that test does work. A little quirky, you know, sometimes gets stuck on and you seem to need to disable DHCP on this to make it work. But yeah, you can enable that test and it'll basically bring the link on a port up and down periodically to determine to help you use it to trace the cable. Very niche use case, but could maybe be useful in a pinch. Other options, you've got DHCP, so you can go into there And this way you can run the DHCP server, which again, you need to be very careful with, because you don't want to do that on a LAN where you don't want to be a DHCP server. But having a little pocket device you can plug in something and make it act as a DHCP server could potentially be quite useful. You know, say you've got, you know, some cameras or just some sort of device that gets an IP address over DHCP that maybe you want to then go into and set a static IP address on, but you need to get an IP over DHCP first to configure it. You know, you could plug this into a switch, plug your device and plug your laptop in and use it. So it does have a DHCP server and also shows the client list. So yeah, bit niche, but it does have that. So it's got built-in traceroute, so you can do a traceroute if you want to. And then link monitor here, which I haven't tried. It doesn't seem to do anything here, but I wonder if it maybe sniffs network traffic on this port here, but obviously I've not got an Ethernet tap, so it's not doing it. Not sure what this does, but it does have this link monitor, which, yeah, I think it might be a traffic sniffer, I'm not quite sure. Not really sure why I would use that on a device like this. But yeah, potentially being able to ping and do the port flashing and stuff could be kind of useful. But yeah, I wouldn't be using this as like a primary device for testing networks like that, but it's the sort of thing that could get you out of trouble in a pinch. The final test that this can do is produce PoE power, as I mentioned earlier, and detect it. This particular tester doesn't have a PoE input on the tester itself. Some of them do, and then they'll measure the voltage. But this one, what you can do is plug a PoE source into the bottom of the wand, remote, whatever you call it, and these LEDs will indicate that there's PoE power there. So on this, we can open up the app here for power output. This just produces PoE just to make it easy to test. Plug that into there, and when that's plugged in, you'll see these LEDs blink, indicating that there's PoE. And just to prove this is actual PoE and not just sort of because it's plugged into the tester, if you take this Raspberry Pi that's got a PoE hat on it, plug it in there, you'll see the LED on the back will light up, so it will actually power a device like a Raspberry Pi. And it'll also show the power consumption. It's quite neat, so you can see it's drawing 1 watt, and obviously as it starts up it'll draw more. It's not got an SD card in it, so it won't actually boot, but you can see it's drawing a few watts. This app is a little quirky. It took me a while to figure out what was going on, because what you'll notice is that when you open the app, test this because it's easier, when you first open the app, it immediately starts outputting PoE, but says PoE off. It's a bit broken, isn't it? But then if you close the app, the PoE output goes away. But I think I've kind of figured it out, because then if you open the app here again the PoE output starts. But if you press this to turn the PoE on, obviously it starts showing the current rating and stuff. But now if you close the app and go out of it, it'll show in the top left that the PoE is still on. You can maybe make it out there. And then the PoE will continue to output with the app closed. So I think it's maybe just, I don't know, a dodgy interface. It doesn't explain really that well what it's doing. When you open the app, it will always output PoE, but if you start the PoE and then close the app, it will then continue to output PoE, which could maybe be useful if you needed to power a device up and then go into another one of these apps and then test it. You know, potentially you could turn the PoE on, set up a DHCP server, and then go into one of the camera testing apps. But, you know, maybe there's a use for it there. It's just a little bit quirky, but yeah. It can output 48 volt PoE, measures the power consumption drawn from it, and then also this device can then detect the presence of PoE. The only thing I did find with this, that when I plugged it into an actual PoE switch rather than this, it's clearly just more like an injector. If I plug it into an actual switch that tries to detect PoE and also negotiate it, it does behave a little bit weirdly, like it sort of blinks on and off periodically. You probably won't get it on camera, but when it's doing the bright flash, and then there's a few sort of smaller dim flashes in between there. You can probably only see the bright one on camera, so it's a little bit fiddly, and on the switch as well, the PoE light's blinking on and off periodically. So it's maybe not negotiating it perfectly, but it does sort of indicate the presence of PoE at least. Just a little bit quirky there. I think if you're testing PoE a lot, you're probably better getting a slightly bigger tester that has a PoE input on the tester. Then you could actually probably monitor the voltage level and stuff as well if the tester supports that, but yeah. It does seem to also work with a separate PoE switch, it just behaves a little bit differently. So there you go. That was a look at the CCTV tester from AliExpress. And actually, I'm really happy with it. I've only had it maybe a couple of weeks at this point, and I've used it a couple of times to test cables, and then being able to use it as a VGA monitor has been extremely useful when setting up servers. So yeah, it's a great little device. I maybe wouldn't buy one of the ones from a UK supplier that charge, £300-400 odd pounds for these, because you're not really getting much benefit apart from their support. But yeah, if you can pick one of these up like I did for 160 quid, it's definitely not a bad deal. So yeah, if you're interested in buying these, I've put links in the description and then probably in a pinned comment as well, so you can take a look at them. And yeah, definitely very happy with it. So there we go. Thank you very much for watching.